everyone, it's Kelvin and welcome back to another watercolor tutorial for Procreate. So in today's video, I've got a really easy project for you. We're going to paint this perfect little stack of pancakes. And this project is aimed at beginners, but I think artists of all skill levels will appreciate the workflow here. So I've already got the Forster watercolor paper loaded into Procreate. And for the brushes, we're going to use the brushes in the regular watercolor kit. And as usual, I'll put links to everything I use in the description below, along with this exact sketch and color palette, so you can follow along with me. So I've got the sketch placed in here as the very top layer, and I've set the transparency mode to multiply so it doesn't cover up what we're going to be painting. And next, I'm going to select a blank layer underneath the paper texture, and this is where we're going to start painting. So what I need to do first is lay down a background wash. So I'm going to use this second color here in the color palette, and I'll just do a long press with my finger. And for the brush, I'm going to use the abstract round brush, which is part of the regular watercolor kit, and at a pretty large size, I'll just roughly fill this in, and I'm not worried about going beyond the edges of the sketch because we can fix that with the eraser later on. Next, I'm going to move on and add some shading to these pancakes. So the tops and the bottoms are going to be sort of a darker brown color, but I want the sides to be pretty light. So I'm going to do the shadows and highlights on separate layers so I can control it. And I'll start with the highlights. So I'll make a new layer. And I'm going to use the first color here in the color palette. Same abstract round brush, maybe a little bit of a smaller size. And I'll just go through and highlight each of the sides. And I'm doing it pretty roughly, so you don't have to worry about following the sketch lines too closely. And once the highlights are done, I'm going to make a new layer and do the darker tops. So for that, I'm going to use this color here. So again, I'll do a long press, and on that separate layer, I'll just roughly fill in the tops. Now the reason I did the sides and the tops on two different layers here is because I want to adjust the opacity and just set them to a point where they look good. So for the tops, I think maybe I'll set that around 70 or 80%. And the sides probably about the same, yeah, about 80% there. And I think that looks pretty good. And once you're happy with how all these layers look, I recommend just merging them all together onto one layer, and that'll keep this kind of simpler to work with. Next, under each pancake, I need to do a little bit of a shadow, and I prefer to do this with the selection tool. So just to make it a little bit easier for me, I'll turn it sideways, and I'll grab the selection tool and set it to freehand, and I'll zoom in on the top pancake here. So I'll make a selection that follows along the bottom, goes to the end, circles back, and then reconnects, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just darken it just a little bit. And again, I'm going to go through and do a shadow under each pancake using this process. And by doing them all separately, one at a time, it lets me adjust the brightness independently so they're not all exactly the same. And I think this makes it look more handmade. Next, I want to separate the plate. And the plate is going to be a white plate with a blue border. So I'm going to separate it first with the selection tool set to freehand. And I'll just follow along the edge of the pancakes like this. Then I'll circle back and then reconnect it. So I've just got the plate isolated and selected. I'll go to my adjustments, hue, saturation, and brightness. And I'll just brighten it and then desaturate it. And just sort of adjust it until it reaches a pretty pale but kind of warm gray color. Now the top of the plate is white, but the side of it, I want to make it a little bit darker because it's in the shadow. So again, I'll grab the selection tool. It's still set to freehand, and I'll just isolate the bottom part here, reconnect it, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just darken it a little bit. And now that all the major shading and coloring is done, this is a good point to get rid of all this excess watercolor going beyond the edges of the sketch. And I'm going to do that with the eraser brush, and I've set it to the fine liner pen. And for the size, maybe around 10%. And I'm first just going to go around and I'm going to cut out, basically just following the sketch. And I'm also going to cut out each of the blueberries as well. And now that everything is cut out, I'm going to use a selection trick to get rid of all the excess watercolor. So I'll grab the selection tool, set it to automatic, and I'm going to click and drag on the pancakes. And when I drag, you can see up here that I set the threshold. And I'm going to set it to a point where only the pancakes are selected, the pancakes and the plate. And they're dark blue, almost black, just indicating that they've been selected. So now what I want to do is flip this selection. So I'll go to invert. Now everything but the pancakes are selected. Now when I open the layers panel, I can tap on this layer and click clear, and it will just delete anything that I hadn't selected. And this is a really useful time-saving trick in Procreate. So if this process didn't make sense, I recommend just skipping back 10 seconds or so and watching this again, because this will save you a lot of time. Now all this is looking really good, and I think I can move on and finish this up with the blueberries. So I'll make those on their own layer. So I'll make a new layer above the pancakes. I'm going to do a long press and grab this blue color. And I'll use the abstract round again. And I'll just carefully fill in each of these berries. And that's pretty straightforward, but up here, there's some weird overlapping strokes going on. So I recommend grabbing the water blender and just kind of smoothing that out. Next, I'm going to select a really dark version of that blue, and I'll use the same abstract round, but at a much smaller size this time, and I'll do a little dot on each blueberry, and this will kind of indicate the stem. And after that, I want to add some really simple shading to these berries to make them look glossy, so I'll select kind of another dark version of that blue. I think the one we used originally was about here, so I'll just do a slightly darker version, and I'll go over it again with the abstract round, and I'll do a kind of a C shape, kind of on the shadow side of each one. And after that, I'll select a lighter version of that blue and add a highlight, kind of using a similar process on the opposite side, maybe just a little bit lighter. And then I'll finish them up by selecting pure white, and I'll do a tiny C around each of the stems like this, and then I'll do a bolder highlight on the top side like that. And we did all of the blueberries and the shading and stuff all on that one layer. So if they don't look right, you're welcome to use the adjustments here and maybe saturate them a little bit, maybe darken them and shift the hue if you want to. Sometimes it turns out well, sometimes it doesn't. That's why I like to do similar colors on their own layers. It just makes it easier to fix it later on. Now on this same layer, I recommend doing the blue rim on the plate. So I'll do a long press and grab that same blue. I'll use the fine liner pen this time. We'll test it out. It looks pretty good. I think for the size, yeah, about 10 or 15% is pretty good. And I'm going to press pretty hard and try to make one smooth stroke going along the rim of the plate. And whenever you're doing any kind of a rim or outline or edge, it kind of subconsciously tells you what that material is. And that's why it's really important to make this as smooth and consistent as possible, because this plate is made of glass, and if it looks bumpy, it just doesn't look quite right. Now over here where I've gone over the pancakes, I'll just cut it back with the eraser. And just like we did it with the blueberries, I recommend doing a kind of a slight highlight or shading along the rim. So this time it's more simple than the blueberries. I'll just select pure white, same fine liner pen, maybe a little bit of a smaller size, and I'll just do a very light, thin highlight. And this one is almost done. For the top pancake here, I recommend doing a little bit of a burn mark, and this is also an opportunity to add an interesting pattern. So I'm going to select the layer that has the pancakes. I'll grab the freehand selection tool. I'll make a selection like this. Circle back, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just darken it and maybe saturate it a little bit. And if it looks a little bit too harsh, you can always go over it with the water blender brush and just break it up in a few areas. And actually, I think while I have the water blender selected and I'm on the pancake layer, I think I'll just go over it in general and smooth it out here and there. And this is all looking pretty good. There are a couple of issues with contrast that I see, so I think next I'm going to move on and add a few outlines. So I'm going to do those on their own layer. So I'll make a new layer, and I'm going to drag it to make sure it's above everything. And for the color, I think I'll just grab the top color there, that brown color. I'll use the Fineliner pen, and I'll just carefully kind of outline the edges of the pancakes here, wherever I think it needs a little bit of help with contrast and detail. Now I did these outlines on their own layer, so I recommend setting that to multiply, lowering it to 0, and then just slowly raising it back up just until they're barely visible. I personally don't really like outlines, so I try to make them as subtle as possible. Now everything is looking pretty good, and I think at this point the illustration could be done. I'll just turn off the sketch here. Now if you wanted to, you could add a little bit of syrup. It's optional, but it's pretty easy. I'll make that on its own layer, so I'll make a new layer again above everything. And for the color, I'll just start with this brown pancake color and choose a slightly lighter version of it. For the brush, I guess I'll use the Fineliner pen. And I'm going to do all of the syrup on its own layer, so that's why I'm not overly concerned about the exact color and shade, because I can change it later on. And I'll just do a little bit of a pool up here. Then I'll do some lines of the syrup kind of dripping down the side. Now the color is close, but not quite right, so I'm going to modify it with the adjustments here. There we go, I think that's a little bit better. Now if you want to, you can also add a little bit of a highlight on the syrup as well, and that'll make it look more kind of shiny and like a liquid. So I'll choose pure white, same Fineliner pen, a much smaller size though, and I'll do some very, very thin kind of outlines along the edges here. And there we go, these pancakes are all done, and here's what it looks like when I print it out. So if you like this tutorial, please drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'd also love to hear what you think about this painting technique, where we sort of go from back to front. It's a little bit unintuitive, I guess, if you're used to doing digital artwork, but this is a really critical thing with traditional watercolor on paper. And at first I thought it was sort of like a limitation of watercolor, but actually I'm starting to realize it's a feature, because when you build your artwork from back to front, the end result just looks more cohesive and put together, because all the elements kind of came together and got finished at the same time. But I'd love to hear what you think about this in the comments down below. And that pretty much wraps it up. As always, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.